On August 1st, 1714, Queen Anne of Great Britain consumed an enormous quantity of blackheart cherries while paralysed and dying in her bed at Kensington Palace. Her physicians recorded this bizarre detail with clinical precision, but no one could explain why a woman who hadn't spoken for 2 days, who couldn't move her limbs, somehow managed to eat what they called an inordinate amount of fruit in her final hours. This wasn't how monarchs were supposed to die, not surrounded by doctors wielding hot irons and bleeding knives, not while politicians literally grabbed her dying hand to force one last signature, and certainly not while eating cherries as her body shut down organ by organ. But then again, nothing about Queen Anne's life had followed the script. She was the woman who buried 17 children, who united England and Scotland into Great Britain, and who spent her final days as a paralysed pawn in a game of succession that could have torn the nation apart. The date was July 30th, 1714. Kensington Palace, 7:30 in the morning. Queen Anne, age 49, sat in her wheelchair in the council chamber, her feet wrapped in blood-stained bandages, her face swollen beyond recognition. She hadn't walked in over a year. In exactly 48 hours she would be dead. But first she would endure medical torture that would make the Tower of London's rack seem merciful. First, she would suffer a stroke on the exact anniversary of her only surviving child's death, July 30th, 14 years to the day. And first, she would make one final political decision while literally unable to speak, a decision that would determine whether Britain descended into civil war. To understand the horror of Queen Anne's final days, you need to understand the body that was failing her. By 1714, Anne wasn't just sick. She was a collection of failing systems barely held together by willpower and the desperate interventions of physicians who understood less about medicine than we do about dark matter. The medical records are explicit in their brutality. Her feet had become so grotesquely swollen from what doctors called dropsy, we'd recognise it as severe edema from heart or kidney failure, that they had to be permanently wrapped in specially made bandages that servants changed multiple times daily. The used bandages were burned because the discharge and blood made them too foul to wash. But here's what made Anne's suffering uniquely horrible. She had systemic lupus erythematosus, though no one would name this disease for another century. Modern physicians studying the contemporary portraits can actually see the evidence. That distinctive butterfly-shaped rash across her face, that portrait artists tried to soften but couldn't entirely hide. Lupus meant her own immune system was destroying her from the inside. Every pregnancy, and she had 17 of them, made it worse. Every child she lost intensified the disease's attack on her organs. The 17 pregnancies. Let that number sink in. 12 ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. 5 children were born alive. 4 died within 2 years. The last one, Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, he made it to 11 years old. Just long enough for Anne to believe she might have an heir. Just long enough for her to plan a future. He died on July 30th, 1700, 6 days after his 11th birthday. She never recovered from that loss, and in one of history's cruelest coincidences she would suffer her fatal stroke on the anniversary of his death. Meanwhile, while Anne's body deteriorated, Britain was transforming into a global superpower. The War of Spanish Succession had just ended. The Duke of Marlborough's victories at Blenheim, Ramillies, and Malplaquet had shattered French dominance in Europe. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 had given Britain Gibraltar, Newfoundland, and exclusive rights to supply slaves to Spanish America, the foundation of an empire that would last 2 centuries. Anne had overseen all of this while unable to walk, while enduring pain that made her scream at night, while knowing that every achievement would die with her because she had no heir. But here's what the history books rarely emphasise. As Anne lay dying in July 1714, 2 separate coups were being planned in the very same palace. The Jacobites, supporters of Anne's Catholic half-brother James, had infiltrated her government at the highest levels. Her own Lord Treasurer, Robert Harley, Earl of Oxford, had been secretly corresponding with James in France. So had Viscount Bolingbroke, who wanted Oxford's job. Both men were technically committing treason, and both were standing in Anne's bedchamber as she died. On the other side, the Whigs had their own conspiracy. The Duke of Somerset and other Whig lords had essentially occupied Kensington Palace in Anne's final days, sleeping in shifts to ensure that no Jacobite could get to the dying Queen alone. They had already sent secret messages to Hanover, telling George Ludwig, the future George I, to prepare his invasion fleet. Yes, invasion fleet. Because that's what it was. A German prince who spoke no English was preparing to sail to Britain with an army, and everyone was pretending this was a peaceful succession. The tension in those final days was suffocating. Servants reported that courtiers were wearing swords in the palace corridors. The guards had been quietly reinforced. Everyone knew that the moment Anne died, whoever controlled the palace would control the kingdom. And Anne knew it too. Even as strokes destroyed her ability to speak, even as physicians tortured her with their treatments, she understood that her death would trigger either a smooth transition or a bloodbath. July 24, 1714, the Privy Council meeting that started the end. Picture the scene. The council chamber at Kensington Palace, wood-panelled walls, windows overlooking the gardens where Anne would never walk again. The Queen, weighing close to 300 pounds by this point, is wheeled in by servants. Her face is crimson and mottled, the lupus rash combined with what doctors called scorbutic spots, probably burst blood vessels. She can barely hold her head up. The meeting was supposed to be routine. Instead, it exploded. Oxford and Bolingbroke, the two most powerful men in government, started screaming at each other. Not polite political disagreement, actual shouting. Oxford accused Bolingbroke of treason. Bolingbroke accused Oxford of embezzlement. Both were probably guilty. The other council members sat frozen as these two men who were supposed to be running the country tore into each other like rabid dogs. Anne watched this unfold, and something inside her, maybe a blood vessel, maybe just her last reserve of strength, snapped. She collapsed forward onto the table, not a gentle faint. A sudden violent collapse that sent papers flying and had servants rushing to keep her from hitting the floor. They carried her to her chambers, and she never truly recovered. But here's the detail that reveals the stakes. She didn't dismiss Oxford immediately. Despite his obvious treason, despite the scene he'd caused, she waited 3 days. Why? Because dismissing him meant choosing a side in the succession crisis. It meant either empowering the Jacobites or the Hanoverians. And Anne, even dying, tried to maintain the balance. July 27th. Anne finally dismisses Oxford. The decision probably took years off her life. Not that she had years left. Hours, maybe. The stress of that confrontation triggered what physicians noted as trembling in her hands, heat in the head with sleepiness, and a little bleeding at the nose. That bleeding at the nose, that was the first sign of the strokes to come. July 28th. Her appetite was quite lost and her spirits sunk. She stopped eating solid food. Her ladies-in-waiting reported that she would stare at nothing for hours, occasionally mouthing words no one could understand. The palace fell into an eerie quiet. Courtiers whispered in the hallways. Everyone was waiting. July 30th, 1714, 7 a.m. Anne woke on the anniversary of her son's death, and perhaps she knew. Perhaps that's why she tried so hard to attend that morning's council meeting. She had decreed July 30th as an annual day of mourning for Prince William, and now, 14 years later, her own body chose this day for its final betrayal. The stroke hit during morning prayers. Not a gentle fading, a violent, convulsive attack that left her thrashing on the floor of her private chapel. Blood poured from her nose. Her eyes rolled back. Her ladies-in-waiting screamed for the physicians who came running with their instruments of torture. Let me explain exactly what those physicians did to a woman who had just suffered a massive stroke, because the medical records are specific, and they're horrifying. First, they bled her. While she was still convulsing, they opened veins in both arms, draining pint after pint of blood into ceramic bowls. The theory was that too much blood was pressuring her brain. In reality, they were dehydrating a stroke victim, reducing blood flow to her already damaged brain. Then came the cupping. They heated glass vessels with flames and pressed them against her back and chest, creating vacuums that burst capillaries and left massive, painful bruises. Anne couldn't speak to tell them to stop. She could only endure. The blistering was next. They took metal instruments, heated them in the fireplace until they glowed, and deliberately burned her skin. The blisters were supposed to draw out bad humours. Instead, they created open wounds on a woman whose immune system was already compromised. They shaved her head completely, every strand of hair removed so they could apply hot poultices directly to her scalp. Imagine the humiliation for a queen who had always been vain about her hair, now bald and burned, unable to protest. And through all of this, she was conscious. The stroke had taken her speech, not her awareness. She could feel everything. She could understand everything. She just couldn't stop any of it. While Anne lay paralysed and bleeding, the palace erupted into carefully controlled chaos. The Whig lords had been waiting for this moment. The Duke of Somerset personally stood guard outside Anne's chamber, sword at his hip, making sure no Jacobite could enter alone. But they needed one more thing from the dying Queen, a final appointment that would secure the succession. The position of Lord Treasurer had been empty since Oxford's dismissal. Whoever held that position when Anne died would effectively control the transition of power. July 31st, sometime in the afternoon. The exact time isn't recorded because what happened next was constitutionally questionable at best. They brought Charles Talbot, Duke of Shrewsbury, to Anne's bedside. Shrewsbury was a moderate, acceptable to both Whigs and some Tories, but firmly committed to the Hanoverian succession. They needed Anne to give him the white staff of office, the symbol of the Lord Treasurer. Here's where the accounts diverge. The official record says Anne, despite being paralysed and speechless from her stroke, somehow managed to indicate her consent and physically hand Shrewsbury the staff. But private letters from courtiers paint a different picture. One witness wrote that Anne's hand had to be guided to the staff. Another suggested her fingers were arranged around it. Think about what that means. They took a paralysed woman's hand, physically manipulated it to hold an object, and called it royal consent. It was technically a coup, executed on a dying woman who couldn't speak to object. But it worked. Shrewsbury was now Lord Treasurer. The Hanoverian succession was secured. The Jacobites had lost their last chance. As night fell on July 31st, Anne's breathing became laboured. The physicians tried one last round of treatments, more bleeding, more blistering, forcing emetics down her throat to make her vomit. Dr. John Arbuthnot, her personal physician, later wrote that these final treatments caused great pain to the Queen. He was the only one who seemed to realise the cruelty of what they were doing. And then, sometime in that final night, came the cherries. The black heart cherries. An inordinate quantity, according to the medical records. How does a paralysed woman who hasn't eaten solid food in 3 days suddenly consume massive amounts of cherries? Did they force them into her mouth? Was it some desperate last attempt at nutrition? Or was it perhaps the one thing she could still swallow, the one pleasure left to a woman who had endured 17 pregnancies, the death of every child, and now this final torture? We'll never know. But the image haunts. Queen Anne, paralysed, bald from the physician's razors, covered in burns and bleeding wounds, somehow eating cherry after cherry in her final hours while the nation held its breath. Dawn broke grey and humid over Kensington Palace. Anne had survived the night, but barely. Her breathing was shallow, rattling. The physicians had finally stopped their treatments. Even they could see death approaching. At 7:30 a.m., with only Dr. Arbuthnot in attendance, Queen Anne of Great Britain died. Arbuthnot's description of that moment has become famous. I believe sleep was never more welcome to a weary traveller than death was to her. Think about those words. Her own physician, the man who had tried everything to save her, was essentially saying that death was a mercy. That after the life she had lived, after the final days she had endured, oblivion was a gift. The moment Anne's heart stopped, the machinery of succession activated. Within minutes, messengers were galloping toward Dover with the news for Hanover. Within an hour, Georg Ludwig was proclaimed King George I throughout London. The Jacobites, who had been so close to power, simply melted away. There was no uprising, no civil war. Anne's final appointment of Shrewsbury, forced though it may have been, had worked. But there was still the matter of Anne's body. For 3 weeks, Anne's corpse remained at Kensington Palace. The delay wasn't about ceremony, it was about logistics. Anne's body had become so swollen from dropsy and obesity that standard royal coffins wouldn't work. They had to construct a special coffin, almost square in shape, massive enough to contain her remains. When the funeral finally took place on August 24th, it took 14 men to carry the coffin, 4 more than usual for royal funerals. The procession moved slowly from Kensington to Westminster Abbey, where Anne would be buried in the Henry VII Chapel. They laid her next to Prince George, her husband who had died in 1708. Around them, in smaller coffins and urns, were the remains of her 17 children. The ones whose bodies had been preserved at least, an entire potential dynasty, extinct, buried in one vault. The funeral effigy created from her death mask still exists in Westminster Abbey's museum. If you look at it closely, you can see the swelling, the distortion of features, the physical evidence of her suffering preserved in wax. Today, we understand what killed Queen Anne in ways her physicians never could. The lupus that destroyed her pregnancies also attacked her brain, causing the strokes. The gout was probably kidney disease, another complication of lupus. The dropsy was heart failure, her body unable to pump fluid effectively after years of systemic damage. The treatment she endured, the bleeding, burning and purging, not only failed to help but actively hastened her death. Every pint of blood they drained weakened her further. Every blister they created risked infection. The barbarism wasn't malicious, it was ignorant. But that didn't make Anne's suffering any less real. Here's what makes Anne's death particularly cruel. She had succeeded at everything except the one thing that mattered most to a monarch, producing an heir. She had united England and Scotland into Great Britain. She had overseen Britain's emergence as a major European power. The Treaty of Utrecht had laid the foundation for the British Empire. But none of that mattered in her final days. She died knowing that her kingdom would pass to a German stranger who had never set foot in Britain. She died knowing that everything she had built might collapse into civil war, and she died on the anniversary of her last child's death, as if fate needed to twist the knife one final time. Queen Anne's death established a pattern we'd see repeated in British royal deaths: the medicalisation of dying, the political manoeuvring around the deathbed, the careful management of succession. But few would suffer as long or as publicly as Anne. Her final days were a medieval horror show performed in an Enlightenment palace, watched by politicians who saw her not as a dying woman, but as an obstacle to their ambitions. But perhaps the most revealing detail about Anne's death isn't the medical torture or the political conspiracies, it's those cherries, that inordinate quantity of black heart cherries consumed in her final hours. Because in the end, after 17 dead children, after years of being unable to walk, after strokes that stole her voice and paralysed her body, after physicians who burned and bled her in the name of medicine, after all of that, Queen Anne found one last small pleasure, one last taste of sweetness before the darkness. Maybe she knew she was dying and wanted one final indulgence. Maybe the cherries were forced on her by physicians trying one last remedy. Or maybe, just maybe, a servant who pitied their suffering queen brought her the only comfort they could offer: fresh fruit on a summer morning, something sweet to ease the passing. We'll never know. But in those cherries lies the human truth of Anne's death. Behind the crown, beyond the politics, past the medical horrors, was a woman who had suffered more than most of us can imagine. And in her final moments she did what any of us might do. She reached for one last taste of life, one last moment of sweetness, before letting go. Dr. Arbuthnot was right. Death was welcome to Anne like sleep to a weary traveller. After 49 years of pain, after burying everyone she loved, after being used as a political pawn, even as she lay paralysed and dying, Queen Anne finally found peace. The last Stuart monarch was dead, the Hanoverian age had begun, and Britain would never be the same. But Anne's true legacy isn't the Acts of Parliament or the military victories, it's the reminder that even queens are human, that power doesn't protect you from loss, that crowns don't shield you from suffering, and that sometimes death really is a mercy. The woman who united Great Britain died broken in body but unbroken in will, having held her kingdom together until her very last breath, even if that breath had to be forced from her paralysed body by the ambitions of the men around her.